For most people, December 31st, 2019 is a time for celebrations, parties, and resolutions. However, for me, it was just another reminder of what I had lost. My husband Michael had died the previous year in a snowstorm that was surrounded by dense woods, and I had been living alone ever since. It was our tradition to spend the winters with my parents in Skagway, Alaska, where they had an old, cozy house surrounded by dense woods, the perfect place to escape the harshness of life. However, last night, a snowstorm roared through my neighborhood, trapping me inside, and I stayed in my first-floor bedroom, sipping tea and attempting to ignore the loneliness that descended on me like the snow outside. At midnight, a strange sound pierced through the chaos of the storm, and the creak of a door opening caused my breath to catch in my throat. I was positive that I had locked all the doors, so I crept to my bedroom door and strained to hear over the wind. The sound didn't repeat, but my imagination ran wild. I stayed up for hours, listening to every groan and creak of the house, and when I finally went downstairs, the front door was locked just as I had left it. I laughed nervously to myself, brushing it off as the wind. "You're being paranoid," I muttered. When the storm passed, I packed my belongings, eager to leave the house for a while, double-checked the locks, and started the long drive to my parents' house. The trip was uneventful until I arrived in Skagway late that evening. The road to my parents' house ended at the edge of the forest, and from there, a narrow snow-filled path wound between tall, shadowy trees. It was always a peaceful walk, but that night the air felt different, heavier as I trudged through the snow, dragging my suitcase behind me. I saw a man in a hoodie standing among the trees, staring at me. His face was hidden by the shadow of his hood, but his posture was tense and deliberate. I stopped in my tracks, my heart racing, and I called out, my voice trembling a little. He didn't answer, just stared. There was something uncanny about him, but I couldn't place it. After a while, he turned and continued walking deeper into the woods. After disappearing from view, I rushed the remaining distance to my parents' house, my mind racing with questions like, who was he, and why did he seem so familiar? For the next few days, I tried to ignore the memory of the hooded man. My parents' house was cozy and welcoming, and it was nice to be with family, but the uneasiness persisted. Then, my boss called and said, "We're facing some unexpected issues," and I grudgingly packed up and drove home. It was late evening when I started, and by the time I got there, it was almost 2 a.m. The house greeted me with a spooky stillness as though it had been waiting. I entered and saw something odd right away, 2 coffee cups on the table in the living room. I remembered washing and putting them away before I left, but I couldn't remember if they were there or if I had simply forgotten. The idea of being so careless bothered me almost as much as the idea of an intruder shaking them off. I went upstairs and locked my bedroom door, and at 3 in the morning, I fell asleep fitfully. As I strained to listen, the sound of crying grew louder and more distinct, a low mournful sobbing echoing through the house. At first, it was faint, like a whisper carried on the wind, and I sat up, my heart racing. My blood ran cold when I recognized the voice. It sounded like Michael. The man from the woods was standing in the dim light of the living room, his hood pushed back to reveal his face. It was Michael, but his skin was pale, and his eyes were pale. I jumped out of bed, barely bothering to grab a flashlight, and hurried downstairs, calling his name even though I knew it couldn't be him. The living room was empty, and the crying stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. I turned to head back upstairs, but as I reached the bottom step, I froze my footsteps behind me. His lips were tinged blue, and he had a hollow, unblinking frost clinging to his hair and eyelashes. He looked at me with an expression that was almost melancholy, but behind it was something else. An insatiable yearning and a darkness. When I woke up, sunshine rushed in and I fell backward, my legs weakening as the room whirled and I hit the floor hard. The house was quiet, the air heavy with an eerie stillness, and I lay on the floor of the living room through the windows, my body hurting from the fall. I slowly sat up, wondering if it had been a hallucination or a dream. I searched the entire house, but I couldn't find anyone else or any signs of moisture. That afternoon, I packed a bag and left the house because I couldn't get rid of the feeling that I wasn't alone. I didn't care about work or the possibility of losing my job. I just needed to be somewhere else. Footprints frost nothing, the coffee cups were still on the table, and everything else was exactly as I had left it. That evening, I felt a little bit of relief that the house was behind me and whatever had haunted me was gone. But even as I write this, I can't help but wonder, was it really me? I called my friend Helena, who lived in a nearby apartment complex, and she welcomed me with open arms and no questions asked. I settled into her spare bedroom. If that was what he wanted, Michael, why did he return? And most disturbing of all, will he return? Before we move on to the next story, I'm not sure if I want to know the answer. Please remember to click the bell symbol for future horror stories and subscribe to our channel if this is your first visit. Please help us out by telling your friends and family about these tales. It's odd how the never-sleeping city can seem so deserted. Up here, 20 stories above the mayhem, it's only me, and the office is silent save for the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. New Year's Eve in New York City is a rock symphony of applauding crowds, honking horns, and the occasional drunken serenade. Being the manager of a mid-sized finance company meant that when deadlines drew near, my social life took a back seat. By 5 p.m., everyone had left, eager to get away before the city plunged into its annual madness. Instead, I was poring over spreadsheets and ledgers to close the books for the year. I should have been with friends, or at the very least, sipping champagne at home while watching the ball drop on TV. Even the cleaning crew had left early, leaving the workplace hauntingly antiseptic and lifeless. I didn't mind, or at least I told myself I didn't. I prefer the silence, but when you're alone yourself by the time the clock struck 10 o'clock at night, the silence has a way of changing and becoming something heavier. Up here, I may as well have been on the moon when I heard a faint but distinct noise, a muffled thump, while I was deep in the process of balancing an account. The room was illuminated by the cold glow of the computer screen, and the windows framed the distant glitter of the metropolis. The first thing that came to me when I froze fingers poised over the keyboard was the HVAC system, which had been acting strangely lately, coughing and moaning like an elderly man. However, this sound was different. It was a rhythmic scuff that sounded like light but constant footsteps. I reassured myself that it was nothing. Perhaps I had left a window open and the wind had knocked against a door, or perhaps the building was simply settling. Then I heard it again, and as I stood up, my heart pounded against my ribs. When I entered the lobby, I saw no one else, and the elevator needed a key card to operate after hours, so I grabbed my phone. The floor was supposed to be empty. As I entered the hallway after turning on a flashlight, the beam of light pierced the darkness. As I approached the break room, I pushed the door open slowly, the hinges whining in protest, and the room was empty save for the faint smell of burnt coffee. I was about to turn around when I noticed something odd. The window by the sink was wide open, the January air seeping through, and it felt like ice against my skin. The illuminated rows of cubicles and the break room door were slightly ajar, and the air felt different, colder, heavier, like the building itself was holding its breath. "Hello," I called out, sounding weaker than I intended, and received no response. I spun my flashlight around after hearing a sound coming from the far end of the corridor, catching a glimpse of movement, just a flicker, like the tail of a shadow vanishing around a corner. "Hey," I cursed myself. "Who's there?" Because of the fear in my voice, I sounded more like prey than an authority figure. Footsteps echoed in the darkness, and I followed them with purpose and speed. My heart was pounding in my ears, so I stopped pushing my back against the wall when I got to the corner. Slowly, I looked around and saw a man in dark clothes standing by the office supply closet with his back to me, but I could see a bulging bag slung over his shoulder and a gun glinting at his waist. Every instinct told me to back off and escape, but my phone vibrated in my hand, possibly a notification, or even a mistaken thumbs up, and a slight sound broke the stillness. The man's face was unshaven and harsh when he spun around. Without saying a word, he raised the gun and pointed it at me, turning around so I could see his growling hands. His eyes were tight and sparkling with something between rage and desperation. I followed his instructions, but my mind kept racing since things like this couldn't be real and didn't happen to people like me. Wallet now, with shaky fingers, I struggled to take my wallet out of my pocket and threw it to the ground. He gestured with a gun for the phone as well, but I wasn't sure if I should give it to him. My mind raced. He must have broken in through the window, but how did he get past the building's security? As he approached the stairwell, he paused and said, "Don't move." I was unable to call for help, but the weight of the gun in his hand was a convincing argument, so I reluctantly dropped the phone next to the wallet. "Good," he muttered, and he backed away slowly, his bag jangling with what sounded like electronics, probably laptops or other office equipment. "Don't call anyone you do," and I'll know it that he disappeared into the stairwell, leaving the door swinging on its hinges. I stood there for what felt like hours, my body rooted to the spot. Eventually, I found the courage to move. I locked the office door behind me and called the police from a desk phone. By the time the officers arrived, the man was long gone. They took my statement, asking questions I couldn't fully answer. Had I seen his face clearly? Did he say anything that might indicate who he was? What had he stolen? I spent the next few days replaying the incident in my mind, dissecting every detail. Something about the man had felt familiar, though I couldn't place why. Then a week later, the pieces fell into place. The police found the stolen items listed for sale online, traced to an account registered under a name I recognized: Ethan Harper. He was one of our newest hires, a quiet guy who kept to himself. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. He'd been in the office that afternoon chatting with a coworker about plans for the new year. I'd even wished him a happy holiday. As he left, the police arrested him at his apartment. He confessed, quickly explaining that he'd overheard me talking about staying late to close the books. He'd planned everything, breaking in through the fire escape, knowing the security cameras were down for maintenance. I tried not to think about what might have happened if I'd made a wrong move that night. The office felt different after that, like it had absorbed the tension and fear of that night. I couldn't look at the break room window without remembering the cold wind on my face. It would never feel the same on New Year's Eve. When someone knocks on your door in the middle of a blizzard, you answer. That was the rule my mother always followed, but one New Year's Eve that rule almost destroyed us. Growing up in rural Minnesota had its perks: the vast grove behind our house, barns to explore and tractors to climb. My siblings and I made endless memories there. But living 3 miles outside a tiny town with fewer than 1,000 people could feel lonely during storms. That loneliness turned into isolation. That winter was one of the harshest I remember. Temperatures plummeted below -50 or in snow piled high enough to bury cars. When the blizzard hit New Year's Eve, my dad, a state trooper, was called out to work. We knew he wouldn't be home until the storm passed, and my mom prepared for a long night with just the 3 of us kids. She brought sleeping bags into the living room, popped in a movie, and tried to make the night festive despite the raging storm outside. We were settling in when the knock came. It wasn't gentle. It was urgent, loud, and insistent. My mom froze. We kids peered into the kitchen, watching as she stood by the door, her hand hovering over the lock. She'd always been cautious, especially when Dad wasn't home, but in a blizzard, anyone outside could be in danger. She turned the lock and opened the door with a crack. A tall, broad man with a fur-lined hood partially hiding his face, snow clinging to his coat, and ice-caked boots stood there. His voice could be heard over the howling wind. "Please, ma'am, my car's stuck." My mother hesitated, but the cold was unforgiving, so she moved aside to let him in. The man stomped the snow off his boots and shed his heavy coat, revealing a rough, weathered face and dark eyes that seemed too calm for someone caught in a storm. "Thank you," he said, flashing a toothy grin. "It's brutal out there. You are lucky to have found a house out here." She asked, "Where's your car?" and he waved a hand vaguely backways, not thinking I would make him upset. He was too calm and at ease, as if he belonged here, but my mom, who was always courteous, pointed him toward the fireplace to warm up my brother, sister, and I. I stayed on the couch and watched him warily. "What are your kids' names?" he asked, turning to face us. Mom's smile was tight, and they were just anticipating the new year. "We're going to have a movie night." "How about you, sweetie? What's your name?" "Alina." Before my mother could respond on my behalf, I stated. His smile broadened, and my stomach turned over. "Alina," he repeated gently, as though to test the term, and the atmosphere became more uneasy. My mother also noticed, and she stood up suddenly. My sister remained silent, her eyes darting nervously to Mom. I tried to concentrate on the movie, but I could feel his eyes on me. He said abruptly, "I've got kids too, a little girl about Alina's age." "That's nice. I'll make some tea. You must be cold," as she busied herself in the kitchen. The man continued talking to us, asking about our favorite games, whether we liked the snow, and whether we'd ever gone sledding at night. My mother's voice was strained as she yelled from the kitchen. "I beg you'd like where I live, which is out in the country with lots of space for play," I said firmly as the man leaned back in his chair and studied me. His smile wavered for a second before widening again. "Of course you do, princess. She's sweet like you love the snow." My mom came back with the tea and gave him a steaming cup. She said, "The storm should pass by morning. You're welcome to stay on the couch until then," he said, sipping the tea, but I was hoping to hit the road sooner. "I wouldn't want to impose. You'd freeze out there." She replied, "You should rest." The man nodded, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. "You're right, best to stay put." The kids went to bed, but I couldn't sleep because something about him felt off. I kept hearing his voice in my head, the way he said my name, and the way he watched me. Hours later, I awoke to a slight creaking sound. The living room was dark, but there was an unsettling glimmer from the moonlight reflecting off the snow outside. He was at the front door, gently twisting the lock, when I peeked out of my sleeping bag to see him creeping into the shadows. I was terrified because he wasn't going anywhere. He was just unlocking the door to let someone in. I pushed my mother, whispering urgently, and she woke up instantly. Her eyes narrowed as she saw him at the door. She quickly grabbed the heavy flashlight she had kept close by and stood there, asking sharply, "What are you doing?" The man froze, his hand still on the lock. He turned slowly, his smile gone, just checking the door. "Don't want it to freeze shut," she said firmly. "Return to the couch." He paused, nodded, and moved away from the door, but my mom remained motionless until he was back on the couch. The remainder of the night was strained, neither she nor I slept. The man remained on the couch, but I could sense the danger emanating from him. At daybreak, when the snow subsided, my mother informed him it was safe to leave, and he put on his coat without protesting. He then turned to face me one more time, perhaps saying, "Maybe I'll see you again." After he left my mom, he locked the door and contacted the police, and when they arrived, they confirmed our suspicions. "Alina," he added, his smile sending a chill down my spine. The man had been wandering through the storm, aiming for remote houses, and they discovered rope and duct tape in his bag, tools for transporting someone that we discovered on New Year's Eve that we had nearly met our demise. The man wasn't merely a lost traveler. He was an intruder who had intended to steal my siblings and me. And if my mother hadn't been watchful, we might not have seen the new year.